I never imagined that caring for my parents would cost me everything. But when my father's will was read, I discovered that loyalty has a price, and mine was exactly $47,000 while my sisters walked away with $27 million each. What I didn't know was that the betrayal went far deeper than money, and the truth would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Dorothy Mitchell, and I'm 68 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been a full-time caregiver to my parents, living in their home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, managing their medications, their doctor's appointments, their daily needs. Before that, I worked as a nurse for 35 years at Lancaster General Hospital. I know about documentation, about patterns, about reading between the lines of what people say versus what they mean. My two younger sisters, Carolyn and Patricia, built different lives. Carolyn became a marketing executive in Manhattan, flying in maybe twice a year for major holidays. Patricia married Richard, a corporate attorney in Boston, and visited even less frequently. But when they did come, it was all performance, bringing expensive gifts, taking photos with mom and dad, posting them on social media with captions about family values. I was the one who held dad's hand through chemotherapy. I was the one who changed mom's bedding at 3 a.m. when she couldn't make it to the bathroom. I was the one who researched clinical trials, fought with insurance companies, and sat in waiting rooms for hours while my sisters sent flowers and made excuses about work obligations. When mom died 2 years ago, dad deteriorated rapidly. The grief hollowed him out. He stopped eating properly, stopped caring about his appearance. I moved into their house permanently, gave up my small apartment, dedicated every waking hour to keeping him comfortable, and he seemed grateful. He'd hold my hand and say, "Dorothy, you're the strong one. You've always been the strong one. Your sisters, they're successful. But you have character." I thought that meant something. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in September. Pancreatic cancer, just like mom. He went peacefully in his sleep, and I was grateful he didn't suffer at the end. The funeral was well attended. He'd been a respected accountant in Lancaster for 40 years. Carolyn flew in with her assistant, wearing designer black and expensive sunglasses. Patricia arrived with Richard, both of them looking polished and professional, like they were attending a business conference rather than burying their father. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at the offices of Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled my parents' estate for decades. I assumed it would be straightforward. Dad had always been meticulous about finances, always fair. He'd told me once, years ago, that he'd make sure I was taken care of because I'd sacrificed so much. I arrived at the law office 15 minutes early, wearing my best dress, a simple navy blue outfit I'd bought for mom's funeral. Carolyn and Patricia were already there, sitting in the conference room with Richard. They were laughing about something, completely at ease. I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest, but I pushed it down. The attorney, James Morrison, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expression of practiced sympathy. He welcomed us in, offered condolences, and opened a leather folder containing the will. "Let's begin," he said, adjusting his reading glasses. "The last will and testament of Thomas Edward Mitchell, dated March 15th, 2024. March 15th, 2024. That was 6 months ago. 6 months before Dad died." "I wasn't aware Dad had updated his will," I said carefully. Morrison glanced at me briefly. "Yes, there were some revisions made to reflect his wishes more accurately." He began reading the standard legal language, then moved to the specific bequests. "To my daughter, Carolyn Jane Mitchell, I leave the sum of $27 million from my investment portfolio and real estate holdings." My breath caught. 27 million? I knew Dad had done well, had been smart with investments, but I'd never imagined. "To my daughter, Patricia Ann Mitchell Thornton, I leave the sum of $27 million from my investment portfolio and real estate holdings." The room tilted slightly. $54 million. My father had been worth at least $54 million, and I'd had no idea. Morrison continued. "To my daughter, Dorothy Louise Mitchell, I leave the sum of $47,000 and my personal effects, including my watch collection and photographs." The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. $47,000. While my sisters received $27 million each, I received $47,000. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Could you repeat that last part?" Morrison's expression didn't change. "To Dorothy Louise Mitchell, $47,000 and personal effects. Carolyn shifted in her seat. Patricia examined her manicure. Richard stared at the table with what might have been discomfort or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell. There must be a mistake, I said, louder now. Dad wouldn't. He told me I'd be taken care of. He knew I gave up everything to care for him and Mom. There's no mistake, Miss Mitchell, Morrison said firmly. Your father was very clear about his intentions when he revised the will in March. He felt that you already owned the family home. He'd transferred the deed to you 5 years ago, and that you had financial stability from your nursing career. Your sisters, on the other hand, were building businesses and had greater capital needs. Building businesses? My voice cracked. I've been wiping our father's face and managing his medications while they've been living in penthouses and taking European vacations. Dorothy, Patricia said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Dad made his decision. He knew what he was doing. He was dying, I said, standing abruptly. He was medicated, confused. He was perfectly lucid, Richard interjected smoothly. I can assure you, the will is completely legal and binding. Your father was evaluated by 2 independent physicians who confirmed his mental competency at the time of signing. Something in his tone made me stop. Something rehearsed, prepared, like he'd been expecting this exact conversation. You, I said slowly, looking at Richard. You helped him revise it. I provided legal counsel, yes, Richard said calmly. That's what attorneys do for family members. But you didn't mention it to me. None of you mentioned that Dad was changing his will. It wasn't our information to share, Carolyn said coolly. Dad's estate planning was his private business. I looked at my sisters, really looked at them, and saw no guilt, no discomfort, no shame, just entitlement. They believed they deserved this, believed I deserved to be discarded like someone who'd provided a service and been adequately compensated. Morrison cleared his throat. If there are no other questions, I have documents for each of you to sign acknowledging receipt of your bequests. I'm not signing anything, I said. Dorothy, don't be difficult, Patricia sighed. This is hard enough without you making a scene. Hard enough? I stared at her. Hard enough for whom? You just inherited $27 million without lifting a finger while I spent 12 years of my life. No one forced you to play martyr, Carolyn snapped, her mask finally slipping. You chose to stay here in this boring little town, playing nurse, acting like you were so noble and self-sacrificing. Well, congratulations, Dorothy. You got exactly what martyrs get. Recognition for your suffering and not much else. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This was my sister, someone I'd grown up with, shared a room with, protected from bullies in elementary school, and she was looking at me like I was nothing. I left the office without signing anything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my car. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how my entire life had been reduced to $47,000, while my sisters walked away with fortunes. The house felt different when I returned. It was mine, technically. Dad had transferred the deed 5 years ago, supposedly as a gift for all my help. But now, I wondered if that had been part of a plan. Give her the house, which needs expensive repairs, and a token amount of cash. She'll be fine. She's always fine. I didn't sleep that night. I went through Dad's study, looking at the photographs on his desk. There was one of all 3 of us girls, taken when we were children. We're sitting on the porch swing, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. We'd been close once. We'd been sisters. What happened to us? 3 weeks passed. I tried to accept what had happened, tried to convince myself that $47,000 was better than nothing, that I should be grateful for the house, but the injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. My sisters hadn't even called to check on me. They'd gotten their money wired to their accounts and disappeared back to their glamorous lives. I was in the kitchen, sorting through Dad's medical files to send to his oncologist's office for record closure, when my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Is this Dorothy Mitchell? A woman's voice, elderly, uncertain. Yes. Who is this? My name is Helen Pearson. I used to work at Morrison & Associates. I was James Morrison's secretary for 32 years before I retired last month. My heart began to pound. Why are you calling me? There was a long pause. Because I can't sleep at night knowing what they did to you. Your father didn't change that will, Dorothy. Your brother-in-law forged it. The kitchen spun. I gripped the counter to steady myself. What did you say? Richard Thornton came to the office 6 times between January and March. He met with Morrison privately. I wasn't supposed to know what they were discussing, but I've been filing documents for 3 decades. I know what attorney-client privilege looks like, and I know what conspiracy looks like. They created a false will, forged your father's signature, and paid off 2 doctors to provide fraudulent competency evaluations. That's not possible, I whispered. Morrison has been Dad's attorney for years. He wouldn't. Morrison's firm is in financial trouble, Helen said bluntly. They're facing a malpractice lawsuit that could bankrupt them. Richard offered him $500,000 to facilitate the forgery. I found the payment record in files I was shredding before I left. I made copies. Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you say something during the will reading? Because I was afraid, Helen said, and I heard genuine fear in her voice. Richard Thornton is a dangerous man, Dorothy. He's destroyed people who got in his way. But I'm 74 years old. I have terminal lung cancer, and I'm tired of staying silent while people like him steal from people like you. You deserve to know the truth. Do you have proof? My voice was steady now, my nursing instincts kicking in. Evidence, documentation, facts. I have copies of everything. The payment records, email exchanges between Richard and Morrison, drafts of the forged will with revision notes. I even have the original will, the real one, that your father filed in 2015. In that version, the estate was divided equally among all 3 daughters. Equally. The word hung in the air like a bell. I need to see these documents, I said. I'm in Harrisburg, Helen said. I can't travel easily anymore, but if you can come here, I'll give you everything. I'll be there tomorrow. Dorothy. Helen's voice softened. Be careful. If Richard finds out you're investigating this, he'll come after you. He has connections, lawyers, judges, people who owe him favors. You'll need to be smarter than him. I've been a nurse for 35 years, I said quietly. I know how to document everything, how to build a case, and how to spot when something's wrong. Richard may be a lawyer, but I've spent my entire career dealing with people who think they're untouchable, and I've learned that the best weapon against arrogance is patience. I drove to Harrisburg the next morning. Helen lived in a small assisted living facility on the outskirts of the city. She was tiny, maybe 90 pounds, with oxygen tubes in her nose and hands that trembled with palsy, but her eyes were sharp and clear. You look like your father, she said when she opened the door. He was a good man. What they did to him, to his memory, it's unforgivable. She handed me a manila envelope, thick with documents. Everything's in there. Payment records, emails, the original will, even photographs I took of Richard and Morrison meeting at a restaurant where they thought no one would recognize them. I've been collecting evidence since January because I knew something wasn't right. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The first document was a bank transfer receipt, $500,000 from Richard Thornton's corporate account to James Morrison's personal account, dated February 10, 2024. Memo line, estate planning consultation. The next was an email exchange between Richard and Morrison. Richard, we need this ironclad. No room for Dorothy to challenge. The competency evaluations must be bulletproof. Morrison, I've arranged for Dr. Stevens and Dr. Chen. Both owe me favors from previous cases. They'll provide the necessary documentation. Richard, and the signatures? Morrison, I have samples from previous documents. My paralegal is skilled at replication. I felt physically sick. This wasn't just greed. This was premeditated fraud, conspiracy, criminal forgery, and my sisters had known. They must have known. There's more, Helen said quietly. She pulled out another document, this one older, yellowed at the edges. This is your father's original will, filed in 2015. Read the distribution clause. I read it, and tears began streaming down my face. To my 3 daughters, Carolyn, Patricia, and Dorothy, I leave my entire estate to be divided equally among them, in recognition of their love and support throughout my life. However, I wish to note that Dorothy has provided extraordinary care during my declining years, and I hope her sisters will honor her dedication by ensuring she is never in financial need. Equal distribution, and a note, a plea, asking my sisters to take care of me. They knew, I whispered. They knew what Dad really wanted, and they stole it anyway. Yes, Helen said, and if you don't fight back, they'll get away with it completely. I stayed with Helen for 3 hours, photographing every document, creating backup copies, building my case. She told me everything she knew about Richard's operation, how he'd done this before to other families, how he specialized in exploiting inheritance disputes and elderly victims. He's a predator, Helen said, and he chose your family because he thought you'd be too kind to fight back. Dorothy, you need to prove him wrong. When I returned to Lancaster that evening, I didn't go home. I went to the office of Sarah Chen, an attorney I'd worked with years ago when she was a young associate representing the hospital in a malpractice case. She was senior partner now at a prestigious firm specializing in estate fraud. I walked into her office and laid the manila envelope on her desk. Sarah, I said, I need to sue my sisters, my brother-in-law, and their attorney for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft. And I need to destroy them so completely that they never hurt anyone else again. Sarah opened the envelope, began reading, and her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to cold fury. Dorothy, she said slowly, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of inheritance fraud I've ever seen. With this evidence, we can not only void the fraudulent will and restore the original distribution, but we can pursue criminal charges. Richard Thornton could go to prison for this. Good, I said, because I'm not just fighting for money. I'm fighting for my father's memory, for the truth, and for every other person who's been victimized by people like Richard who think kindness is weakness. This won't be easy, Sarah warned. They'll fight back hard. Richard has resources, connections. He'll try to discredit you, paint you as a bitter daughter who's lying for money. Let him try, I said. I have 40 years of documentation habits. I have medical records proving I was Dad's primary caregiver. I have testimony from doctors, neighbors, hospice workers, and I have something Richard doesn't have. The truth. Sarah smiled for the first time. Then let's go to war. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. The local news picked it up immediately. Daughter sues sisters over $54 million estate fraud. The story went viral on social media. Suddenly, everyone in Lancaster was talking about the Mitchell family drama. Carolyn called me the day the lawsuit became public. What the hell do you think you're doing? She screamed into the phone. You're embarrassing us, embarrassing Dad's memory. Dad's memory! I cut her off. You forged his will, Carolyn. You stole his estate. You're the one disgracing his memory. You can't prove any of this, she hissed. Richard says your so-called evidence is fabricated. He says that woman, that secretary, she's a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Then you have nothing to worry about, I said calmly. We'll let a judge decide who's telling the truth. Dorothy, listen to me. Carolyn's voice shifted, becoming pleading. We can settle this quietly. We'll give you more money, say $2 million. You drop the lawsuit, we all move on. $2 million? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Out of $54 million, you're offering me $2 million? That's not a settlement, Carolyn. That's an insult, and it's an admission of guilt. You're making a mistake, she said coldly. Richard has already filed countersuits for defamation and harassment. He's going to destroy you in court. We'll see, I said, and hung up. The next 3 months were brutal. Richard's legal team tried every tactic, filing motions to dismiss, claiming the evidence was inadmissible, attempting to have Helen's testimony excluded because of her cancer diagnosis, suggesting she was medicated and unreliable. They portrayed me as a jealous, bitter woman who'd manipulated a dying former employee into creating false documents. But Sarah was brilliant. She systematically dismantled every argument. She subpoenaed Richard's bank records, proving the $500,000 payment to Morrison. She brought in handwriting experts, who testified that Dad's signature on the fraudulent will was forged. She found the 2 doctors who'd provided the false competency evaluations, and got one of them to flip, admitting he'd been paid to lie. The case went to trial in February. The courtroom was packed, media, curious locals, and my former colleagues from the hospital who came to support me. Carolyn and Patricia sat behind Richard's defense table, both looking immaculate and composed, but I noticed Patricia wouldn't meet my eyes. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Sarah presented our evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case. Helen testified via video link from her hospice bed, and her testimony was devastating. She described in detail how Richard had orchestrated the entire fraud, how Morrison had facilitated it, how they'd laughed about how easy it was to manipulate an old man dying of cancer. Richard took the stand in his own defense. He was smooth, confident, denying everything. But Sarah cross-examined him brilliantly, catching him in multiple contradictions, showing the jury emails where he discussed handling the Dorothy problem. The moment that broke the case came when Sarah introduced a piece of evidence I hadn't known about, a recording. Helen had secretly recorded one of Richard's meetings with Morrison, where they explicitly discussed forging the will. Pennsylvania is a two-party consent state, but the recording was admissible because it captured evidence of an ongoing crime. On the recording, Richard's voice was clear. Make sure Dorothy gets next to nothing, just enough that it doesn't look suspicious. She's too soft to fight back, and even if she does, we'll bury her in legal fees until she gives up. Morrison's response: what about the sisters? Are they on board? Richard: Carolyn knows the full plan. Patricia suspects but doesn't want details. She'll go along with anything as long as she gets her money. Neither of them cares what happens to Dorothy. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order. Carolyn went pale. Patricia started crying. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, theft by deception. The fraudulent will was voided. The original 2015 will was reinstated. Richard Thornton was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. James Morrison lost his law license and received 5 years. The 2 doctors who provided false competency evaluations had their medical licenses suspended, but the verdict was only the beginning of the consequences. The estate was divided equally, as Dad had originally intended. Each of us received $18 million. But Carolyn and Patricia were also ordered to pay me additional damages, $2 million each, for emotional distress and the years of caregiving they'd benefited from while contributing nothing. More devastating than the financial judgment was the public exposure. The trial revealed that Richard had run similar schemes on at least 3 other families. Federal prosecutors opened investigations. Carolyn's company fired her when the fraud became public, citing reputational damage. Patricia's social circle in Boston ostracized her. Richard's other victims began coming forward. There was an elderly man in Pittsburgh whose nephew had stolen his entire estate using Richard's playbook. A widow in Philadelphia who'd been convinced to sign over her home to her stepson through forged documents Richard had prepared. The FBI built a case that would keep Richard in prison far longer than 8 years. The day the final verdict was read, I stood on the courthouse steps facing a wall of cameras and reporters. Sarah stood beside me, and behind us were 5 other families Richard had victimized. People who'd found the courage to come forward because I'd fought back. A reporter shouted a question. Dorothy, how does it feel to finally get justice? I thought about that question carefully before answering. Justice isn't just about money, I said. It's about truth. My father was a good man who worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. He trusted the wrong people, and they betrayed him in the worst possible way. But his real legacy wasn't the money he left behind. It was the values he taught me. Integrity, perseverance, the belief that doing the right thing matters even when it's difficult. I paused, looking directly into the cameras. Richard Thornton and his conspirators thought they could steal from my family because they believed I was too kind, too passive, too old to fight back. They mistook compassion for weakness. They learned too late that the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose except their integrity and who refuses to surrender it. Another reporter called out, "What about your sisters? Will you ever reconcile with them?" I felt a sharp pain in my chest at the question. My sisters made their choices. They chose money over family, greed over loyalty. They participated in a conspiracy to rob me of my inheritance and dishonor our father's memory. Those aren't mistakes you forgive and forget. Those are betrayals that destroy relationships permanently. Do you have a message for other families facing similar situations? Yes, I said firmly. If you suspect inheritance fraud, if you feel like something isn't right, trust your instincts. Document everything. Seek legal counsel. And don't let anyone convince you that fighting back is ungracious or greedy. Standing up for yourself, protecting what's rightfully yours, that's not selfishness. That's self-respect. And most importantly, I continued, don't underestimate yourself because of your age, or because someone has convinced you that you're not strong enough to fight. I'm 68 years old. I spent my career caring for others, putting their needs first. People like Richard prey on caregivers because they assume we're too kind to seek justice. Prove them wrong. Sarah stepped forward. I'd like to add that this case represents a disturbing pattern of elder financial abuse. Richard Thornton specifically targeted families with aging parents, exploiting their vulnerability to steal millions. The conviction today sends a message that these crimes will be prosecuted aggressively and punished severely. As we walked away from the courthouse, Helen called my cell phone. She was watching from hospice on live stream. "You did it," she said, her voice weak but triumphant. "Dorothy, you actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." "I'm so tired," Helen whispered, "but I can rest now knowing I did one right thing before the end." "You did more than one right thing," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You saved my life, Helen. You gave me back my father's legacy and my own dignity." Helen died 3 days later. I attended her funeral, along with the other families she'd helped by coming forward. We created a scholarship in her name at the local community college for students studying paralegal work, a tribute to a woman who understood that justice sometimes requires courage from unexpected sources. The money from the settlement changed my life, but not in the ways people might expect. I didn't buy a mansion or take extravagant vacations. Instead, I established the Thomas Mitchell Foundation for Elder Justice, a nonprofit that provides legal assistance to families fighting inheritance fraud and financial abuse of the elderly. I hired Sarah's firm to run the legal clinic. We've helped 43 families in the past 2 years recover stolen assets and prosecute fraudulent caregivers, family members, and attorneys. Every case we win feels like another victory for Dad, another way of honoring his memory. I also wrote a book about my experience, The Inheritance Fraud, How I Fought My Family and Won. It became a bestseller in the true crime category. I donated all proceeds to the foundation. I've been interviewed on national news programs, invited to speak at legal conferences, asked to testify before Congress about strengthening laws against elder financial abuse. My sisters never contacted me after the verdict. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Carolyn moved to Florida and works in a shopping mall managing a retail store. Patricia divorced Richard while he was in prison and returned to Pennsylvania, living quietly in a small town under her maiden name. They spent their settlement money on legal fees and IRS penalties. It turned out Richard had been hiding assets and evading taxes for years, and both sisters were implicated as beneficiaries of his fraud. Sometimes I think about calling them, about trying to rebuild what was destroyed. But then I remember how they looked at me in that conference room, how easily they dismissed my sacrifice, how willingly they participated in stealing from me. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Last month, I received a letter from a woman in Oregon who'd read my book. Her son-in-law had convinced her husband to change his will before he died, leaving everything to their daughter and nothing to her. She was 72, afraid, and didn't know if she had the strength to fight. I called her immediately. "You have the strength," I told her. "I know you do, because you had the courage to reach out, to ask for help, to refuse to accept injustice. That's the first step, and you're not alone anymore. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win." And we did. 3 months later, after our legal team proved the will had been modified under duress, she received her full inheritance, $3.2 million. She cried on the phone when I told her the verdict. "How can I ever thank you?" she asked. "Pass it forward," I said. "Help someone else who needs it. That's how we change things. One case, one family, one victory at a time. I'm 70 years old now. I live in the house my father built, surrounded by his photographs and memories. But I'm not the same woman who sat in that attorney's office 2 years ago and heard she was worth $47,000. I'm stronger, wiser, and far less willing to accept injustice quietly. People ask me if I regret the fight, if I wish I'd just taken the $47,000 and moved on with my life. The answer is always the same. No, because this was never just about money. It was about standing up for myself, honoring my father's true wishes, and proving that kindness isn't weakness. It's a choice. And when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, when they assume you'll stay silent while they rob you blind, that's when you show them exactly how strong a kind person can be when they decide to fight back. My father used to say that character is what you do when no one's watching. But I learned something else through this experience. Courage is what you do when everyone's watching and judging and waiting for you to fail. I fought back. I won. And I'm still fighting for every other person who's been told they're too old, too kind, too weak to stand up for themselves. Because the most powerful thing in the world isn't money or connections or legal expertise. It's a person who knows their worth and refuses to settle for less. And once you understand that, once you truly believe it, no one can ever take it away from you again. Not your sisters, not your family, not anyone. That's the real inheritance my father left me. Not millions of dollars, but the understanding that I deserved better than $47,000 and a pat on the head. And that understanding, that knowledge of my own worth, is priceless. So if you're facing a similar situation, if someone's trying to steal what's rightfully yours, if you're being told to be grateful for scraps while others feast, remember this: you deserve better. You're worth more, and you have the power to fight back. All you have to do is start. Now tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have accepted the $47,000? Or would you have fought back? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment.